think we're ready to go. How's that? Okay. I'm very happy to see all of you. I'll try to explain what's going on here. My name is Robert McDonald, and I'm a member of the Proust Reading Group. This event is co-sponsored by the Proust Reading Group and the New York Society Library. Our reading group, which was started 51 years ago to read the world's great literature, beginning with Proust, was looking for a way to honor those members who have died over the years. What better way, we thought, than pay tribute to them through paying tribute to Proust, who gave us our first book and whose influence runs deeper as the years roll by. We settled on doing something for the 100th anniversary of Proust's death, officially yesterday, November 18th. We approached an old friend from the New York Society Library, Jeanette Watson, one of the bright lights of the New York literary scene over the last 40 years. When we told her what we had in mind, she and the library were eager to collaborate. Important literary events have been regularly held at the New York Society Library, which is the oldest reference library in the country. Originally founded in 1700, wait a minute, that's 400 years ago, during the administration of the Earl of Belmont, the old public library was reincorporated in 1754 by a group of New Yorkers who called it the New York Society Library, which still, believe it or not, has an overdue book from George Washington. In 1843, at Ralph Waldo Emerson's lecture series in the library, right here, Emerson and Walt Whitman met for the first time. Herman Melville used this library for sources for Moby Dick, such as William Scoresby's An Account of the Arctic Regions with a history and description of the northern whale fishery. The Proust Reading Group was formed in 1971 by some well-educated but decidedly non-scholarly people for the purpose of reading À la recherche du temps perdu, which was then called Remembrance of Things Past, as translated by Scott Moncrief. On our second reading of Proust, 25 years later, the title had been changed to In Search of Lost Time, in Kilmartin's revision of the Moncrief's translation. Our reason for first reading the work was its stature, its length, and its difficulty. We realized that we could not do this on our own, so we formed a group. If we managed to climb this mountain, we thought we would join an exclusive group of perhaps 1,000 people who had finished the book, and an even more exclusive group of 100 who had not lied about it. Did we learn anything during our reading and discussions? We certainly learned one thing. Proust convinced us that it was worthwhile reading the great books. If we could not be creative artists ourselves, like the hero of Recherche, we could at least regard reading itself as a creative act. And so now in our 51st year, we have done so. Every reader wrote Proust, as he reads, is actually the reader of himself. The writer's work is only a kind of optical instrument he provides the reader, so he can discern what he might never have seen in himself without this book. We wanted to use this occasion, as I have said, to pay tribute to those members of our reading group who are no longer with us. It was for this reason that we collaborated with the New York Society Library to host this roundtable with its world-famous Proust experts. I think that term is quite accurate. Under the wise and cheerful leadership of Noam Scheindlin of CUNY, Noam, who taught and continues to teach Proust seminars at the 92nd Street Y, is a mentor and friend to many of us, and an inspiration to many more. The absent friends we are honoring today are David Sawyer, Sidney Kahn, whose wife is here today, Mark Hampton, whose wife is here, Noonie Marks, whose daughter is here, Leola MacDonald, whose whole family is here, Iris Sawyer, Ashton Hawkins, whose husband is here. I want to thank you very much for coming to this event and helping us honor the people we've lost.
Longtemps, je me suis couchée de bonne heure. Parfois, à peine la bougie éteinte, mes yeux se fermaient si vite que je n'avais pas le temps de me dire « je m'endors ». Et, une demi-heure après, la pensée qu'il était temps de chercher le sommeil m'éveillait. Je voulais poser le volume que je croyais avoir encore dans les mains et souffler ma lumière. Je ne vais pas cesser en dormant de faire des réflexions sur ce que je venais de lire. Mais ces réflexions avaient pris un tour un peu particulier. Il me semblait que j'étais moi-même ce dont parlait l'ouvrage.
For a long time, I went to bed early. Sometimes the candle just barely out, my eyes closed so quickly that I did not have time to tell myself I'm falling asleep. An hour and a half later, the thought that it was time to look for sleep would awaken me. It would make as if to put away the book, which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had gone on thinking while I was asleep about what I had just been reading, but these thoughts had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was the immediate subject of my book.
Hello everyone, I'm Noam Scheindlin, and I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Proust Reading Group and the Society Library, and to thank our panelists who have generously agreed to share their time with us together and to celebrate Proust with us here in New York on the 100th anniversary of his death. In an essay that Proust began around 1908, not just any essay, but the one that became In Search of Lost Time, Proust writes, "A book is the product of an other self than that which we manifest in our habits, in society, in our vices. This other self, if we want to try to understand it, we have to try to recreate it in the depths of ourselves." Proust, who is arguing against the idea put forward by the critic Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve, the idea is that in order to really understand an author's work, he's arguing with Sainte-Beuve's idea that in order to understand an author's work, you need to understand the author's biography. Proust tells us that it is not the I who writes, the I who we're all so familiar with and who's accompanied us all up to this point, but a different I, perhaps one not even worthy of the word because it doesn't yet exist. It's in the depths of ourselves, in trying to recreate it in ourselves, the self confronted with the blankness of its potential. Terrible uncertainty, Proust writes, when the seeker is at the same time that obscure region where he must go seeking. In the novel, we start with the older narrator remembering what he always remembers, the bedtime scene. Then, with the Madeleine that his mother gives him, the experience of all that he's lived is made available to him and to us, his readers. We continue with the narrator through his life, from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, in Cambrai, in Paris, in Balbec, in Venice, in wartime Paris, and we pass by surreptitiously that moment when later in his life the narrator's mother offers him a Madeleine. We continue to the Guermantes matinée, the big party at the end of the book, and only then, at the end of the book, does the narrator realize his vocation as a writer and tells us about the book he will write. And along with the narrator's realization, we realize then that all we have read has not yet been written. And so we hold in our hands at once two books, the one that we have read and the one that has not yet been written will remain perpetually unwritten. I think that there's something wonderful, something universally human and humble in Proust's narrator's offering to us his unwritten book. It reminds us that we too are writing an unwritten book, the book that Proust calls l'œuvre de soi, the work of the self. And if the narrator's book exists in potential, so does our own, until maybe at the end of it all, we too realize our vocation and what we can make of all that wasted time. And inasmuch as Proust was accused of snobbery in his lifetime, what he writes, the book that emerges from this I, is full of humility and respect for human experience, reminding us that as readers of the world we live in, readers of ourselves, we are all writers. And In Search of Lost Time is, in at least this way, an active commemoration of all the writing that has never been written, of the nameless and languageless perceptions that could have been caught and turned into narrative. It's a place where we are all now, a place of terrible uncertainty and potential. So I would like to then begin our discussion, but first by introducing our four panelists. In order of where they are seated, Christine Cano, I'm sorry, I keep using the name of the principal of my school, my boys' school. Christine Cano's book, Proust's Deadline, brings together the publication history of In Search of Lost Time, Proust's process of composition, and Proust's own intimations of mortality, and shows how all these get inscribed into the novel. She's written on Proust and André Gide, on Proust during wartime and the wartime press, on reception histories and political travel writing. She comes to us from Cleveland, where she's associate professor of French at Case Western Reserve University, and we're very happy to have you here with us. Antoine Compagnon is the author of many books on literary history and criticism, from the Renaissance to modernity, including Proust Between Two Centuries, and most recently Proust du Côté Juif, which considers the Jewish side of Proust, and La Vie derrière soi, an exploration of writing and aging in what has come to be called late style. Professor Compagnon teaches at Columbia, where he's the Blanche W. Knopf Professor of French and Comparative Literature, and was Professor of Modern and Contemporary Literature at the Collège de France until recently. He's also recently been inducted into the Académie Française. So in the future, if you come across new words in your French dictionary, you can feel reassured that they come with Professor Compagnon's sanction. Elisabeth Ladenson's book, Proust's Lesbianism, is essential reading, treating an aspect of Proust that had largely been unexplored, but in doing so, helping us to understand the complex persona of the Proust narrator. She's also written Dirt for Art's Sake, books on trial from Madame Bovary to Lolita, and she's working on a book called Proust in the Margins, Jew, Homosexual, Snob. She's professor of French and Comparative Literature at Columbia, and she's the general editor of the Romantic Review. Welcome. Edmund White is the author of many novels and essays, much too many to name, but they include Forgetting Elena, A Boy's Own Story, The Beautiful Room is Empty, and most recently, A Previous Life, although there is a new one coming, I believe. His importance in helping to craft a literature that represents gay life can't be understated, in addition to his important work in non-literary ways, particularly during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. He's published biographies of Arthur Rimbaud, Jean Genet, and of Marcel Proust, and he was named the 2018 winner of the PEN Saul Bellow Award for Achievement in American Fiction, and received the 2019 Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters from the National Book Foundation. Welcome. We've organized this discussion around a series of selection from Proust's novel, which will be read by our readers, Paul Moran and Phil Ankah. And you can find the passages that they will read in your programs, so that if you like, you can follow along.
We couldn't get a program, is there another one?
Okay, so I think that we will hear the first of the selections that we've chosen. This one comes early on in the novel, just after the Madeleine moment in the book. So we begin now with the memory, more than the memory, the experience of childhood in the familial house at Combray, where the narrator would spend his summers. So here is the origin of the Madeleine that his mother gave him with his Aunt Léonie.
My grandfather's cousin, by courtesy my great aunt, with whom we used to stay, was the mother of my Aunt Léonie, who, since my husband's, my Uncle Octave's, death, had gradually declined to leave. First Combray, then her house in Combray, then her bedroom, and finally her bed. And now never came down, but lay perpetually in a state of grief, physical debility, illness, obsession, and piety. My aunt's life was now practically confined to 2 adjoining rooms, in one of which she would rest in the afternoon, while the other was being aired. They were rooms of that country order, which, just as in certain climes, whole tracts of air or ocean are illuminated or scented by myriads of protozoa, which we cannot see, and chance us with the countless odors springing from the virtues, wisdom, habits, a whole secret system of life, invisible, superabundant, and profoundly moral, which their atmosphere holds in solution. Smells natural enough indeed, and weather-tinted like those of neighboring countryside, but already humanized, domesticated, snug, an exquisite, skillful, limpid jelly, skillfully blended from all the fruits of the year which have left the orchard for the storeroom, smells changing with the year, but plenishing and homely, offsetting the sharpness of hoarfrost with the sweetness of warm red. Smells lazy and punctual as a village clock, roving and settled, heedless and provident. Linen smells, morning smells, pious smells, rejoicing in a peace which brings only additional anxiety, and in a prosaicness which serves as a deep reservoir of poetry to the stranger who passes through their midst without having lived among them. The air of those rooms was saturated with the fine bouquet of a silence so nourishing, so succulent, that I never went into them without a sort of greedy anticipation, particularly on those first mornings, chilly still, of the Easter holidays, when I could taste it more fully, because I had just arrived in Combray. I would go in and kiss her. Françoise would be making her tea, or if my aunt felt agitated, she would ask instead for her tisane, and it would be my duty to shake out the chemist's little package onto a plate the amount of lime blossom required for infusion in boiling water.
The passage goes on, but we decided to cut it off here in the interest of time and thematics. But I think that Aunt Léonie has become a particularly compelling character over the past couple of years. We've all become a little like Aunt Léonie, barricaded in our homes, looking out the window, holding fast to our daily rituals. But in the passage that we just heard, there's a series of contraries, antinomies going on: lazy, punctual, roving, settled. And and which finally gives us a prosaicness, which yields a deep reservoir of poetry to the stranger who passes through their midst without having lived among them. I wonder if this is a description of the narrator. He's partly of Combray and partly a stranger to it, an itinerant wanderer. And so even though the narrator here is introducing Combray to us, perhaps Proust is also reintroducing the narrator. So I'm interested in what you think about this dual persona, which we find in Proust, both inside, both part of, and outside. I'm going to take that on. Elisabeth?
Well, actually, if I'm sorry, I actually realized that you were asking something else, but so I'm just going to answer a different question, if you don't mind, which is, who is this a portrait of? Because in fact, it seems like the sort of reclusive, hypochondriacal individual is kind of a portrait of the artist as an old lady. And one thing that I think is interesting is that people tend to assume that the Recherche is basically a somewhat more or less disguised autobiography. But at some point, I became interested in looking at the extent to which the family in the novel doesn't at all correspond to Proust's family, because in fact he took the two sides of his family and kind of selectively put them together in a way that doesn't really make sense, because he wasn't very interested in verisimilitude. He wasn't really interested in coherence all that much. And what emerges is because so Proust's first, not Proust's first biographer, but Proust's biographer, George Painter, whose biography, whose two-volume biography first published in the 50s, became definitive for quite some time because he was able to incorporate new material that André Mauroy had previously definitive biographer had not had access to. He says that he describes Proust's aunt, Proust's paternal aunt, Elisabeth Ladenson, as being hypochondriacal and increasingly reclusive. And I tried to figure out, and maybe you can answer this, I tried to figure out where this came from. And I concluded that in fact it doesn't, what it comes from is the book, is the novel. And in fact, Proust's paternal aunt, Elisabeth Ladenson, was, well, first of all, I mean, if you look at my great aunt, the mother of my aunt Léonie, I mean, the mother of his aunt Elisabeth Ladenson was his paternal grandmother, of whom there is no mention in his entire correspondence, and there's one picture of her where she does not at all fit with the rest of the family. I mean, she was a very different creature from the mother's side of the family, and she was not a widow. Her husband, in fact, outlived her. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try not to, because it seems to me that I just want to emphasize that it's really a mistake to think that this is a portrait of Proust's family. But I think this is a portrait of Proust, in fact.
Yes, but at the same time, it is because of Combray that there is a very powerful myth of Proust. Combray has become a place of Combray-Illier, the village that supposedly...
Well, it even says outside of the village, the two names, Illier.
Yes, now it's called Illier-Combray, the village of Illier, where Proust almost never went, which means that this is a myth. Because as Elisabeth said, Proust made a sort of mixture of Illier on the paternal side, and Auteuil on the mother's side, and he went to Auteuil much more often than to Illier. But still, Auteuil is the suburbs of Paris. Illier is provincial, is the country. And now the house at Illier is a house of pilgrimage. It's one of those maison d'écrivains visited by many people. And so when you go to Cambrai, Cambrai-Illier, which I don't often do, you have the bed of Aunt Léonie with the tilleul and the madeleine on the bedside table. And we cannot forget that those passages are the first passages that were included in manuals when Proust was little by little introduced in schools, which was very late, by the way. And it's Cambrai. It's Cambrai, the sort of mythical provincial village with the family, the aunt, Françoise, the maid, that really made Proust initially readable and popular. So it's a very important passage, if only for that reason.
Sure, I have been also to the museum, La Maison de Tante Léonie, as it's called, and can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. And the thing is that the reaction that I had, it turns out that lots and lots of people have, which is you go up the staircase, having read the passage many times, you go up the staircase and you think about the staircase and the house in general. It seems so small. It seems so much smaller. Well, that's because, in fact, the description is not just that house. It's also the much grander house in Auteuil, which was torn down which was torn down long ago. So, I mean, I wonder. Yes, certainly. Yes, there's this provincial mythology. And there's no way to make a museum out of the house in Auteuil because it doesn't exist. Anyway, I'll shut
up. Well, if we could talk about not just his parents, but also the family that we see in the book, I think it's interesting that it's Aunt Léonie who gives the narrator the original legend, right? And then it's the mother. Aunt Léonie comes from the father's side of the family, and then it's the mother who gives him the madeleine later on in his life. And so, in a certain sense, the father's side and the mother's side of the family, and Aunt Léonie and the mother, get united in this kind of madeleine. We know that the father's side is less rigorous, less principled, more perhaps capricious than the mother and the grandmother. And so I'm interested in talking about perhaps the narrator as sort of absorbing both different wings of the family in the book, the mother's side.
But as Elisabeth said, the family tree is very nebulous in Cambrai. We are not sure on which side we are, and
it changes. In fact,
it changes. Yes, so it's and Proust doesn't care about that. Proust is not Zola. It's not rigorous in terms of realism and verisimilitude. He doesn't care about that. So he will change. I mean, as we know, Françoise will never age for decades.
And many of the minor characters die, and then they reappear.
And die, yes. So we
sometimes they die again, actually.
I mean, the difference between the mothers. What is certain is that in the first pages of Cambrai, the father is a bit of a bore and quite ridiculous with his mania about the barometer. He's always checking the barometer instead of looking out the window. So certainly it's not, the father is a bit of a ridiculous character in Cambrai compared to the mother and the grandmother. But it's also very striking is the importance of the grandmother. So as Elisabeth, I think, mentioned, or someone mentioned, the grandmother, a number of passages in the book that deal with the grandmother, the death of the grandmother, the mourning of the grandmother are in fact displaced from the death of the mother, and she is completely displaced. And the grandmother in the first pages of Combray is a victim of the whole family. I mean, the sort of sadism against the grandmother is very striking in the first pages. She's the best moral person in the novel. She's the one who distributes love all the time, and she's the victim of everybody, including the narrator.
So if you can hear me? Yes. So I think I'd like to add something to that, which is a dimension that's become so important in Proust studies, which is working with the drafts. And it's in the drafts of the novel, many of which are published in the Pléiade edition, that you see the instability of characters' identities. Tante Léonie is an example of that in earlier drafts. You had the same ideas developed, but with respect to a different character. So there's the instability of family members' identity, and with that, what comes through the final passage is the density of this sort of allegorical portrait. Tante Léonie has become reified by her presence in the museum at Ilie Combray, but there was a lot of fluidity when Proust was writing this passage, and she becomes kind of like an allegory of the confined, of the grand malade, the hypochondriac character, perhaps really ill, the hypochondriac, the chronically ill patient. It's more like the expression of an allegorical idea, which you see a lot in Combray.
One of the things I felt in reading Proust was that he was like a combination of or a very good point between Dickens and Henry James. I mean, he's as subtle as Henry James, but the characters have very strong outlines the way they do in Dickens. And in a way, what's interesting is that somebody like Monsieur de Charlus, he is shown as very complex, but only in successive snapshots, each one of which is very clear and very definite. In other words, Henry James might take a character and want to show him in the round, but he would be so subtle in his shading that the character wouldn't be very memorable. Whereas Charlus is probably one of the most memorable characters in Proust, and you can see the influence of Dickens, but also, of course, of Balzac. Balzac. I mean, he wants to. Like for instance, the Abbé in Balzac, the Vautrin, is presented in successive chapters and successive books as a kind of entirely different person. He's a criminal, but he pretends to be an abbé. He is a homosexual, but he's head of the secret police. I don't know what all. And so he has many facets which are explored only one at a time. I mean, the James method, which I know probably lots of you here are Jamesians, but I don't like James because I feel that he's always canceling out his effects. That it's the super subtle fry, as he called it, of his books, and that the method, that the Dickensian method, is very good for having a character with one or two traits that you remember and that are very strong in their outline. Like painters will argue always whether the painting should be an outline or it should be the shading. And Proust is both. And I don't know, that's just my idea.
No, I agree with that, absolutely. when I wrote that book, which was called Proust entre deux siècles, Proust between two centuries, that was really, it's really the ambivalence of Proust. The power of Proust comes from that ambivalence, being both Balzac. In French, I said Proust is both Balzac and Blanchot. These two sides, you have the pleasure of reading Balzac, and at the same time, the complexity of reading James or Blanchot.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I think that's,
it's the reason, one of the reasons of his appeal still nowadays.
I can't wait to read your book about the Jewish side of Proust, because you're writing on that too.
Yeah.
And I don't think very many people know about that. I mean, they know that his mother was Jewish. She was from a stockbroker family. The
grandfather was a stockbroker.
Yeah.
Yeah, they argue about whether he was a good Jew or an anti-Semite, which is not a fruitful argument.
No, there are many interesting things about the family, his mother's family, which are now better known.
Thanks to you, too.
Yeah, his great-grandfather, who made a fortune, was really one of the main members of the Jewish community in Paris, and nobody had really insisted on that he was one of the very few who, at the foundation of the Jewish community in Paris under the First Empire and the Restoration from 1800 to 1830. And he is the one who found the finance the first synagogue in Paris. When you go to the synagogue, Rue Notre-Dame de Nazareth, you have Baruch Weil on all the walls, his name, because he's the one who got the money to create the first synagogue in Paris. And Proust's great-grandfather was also the official Mohel, the one who
Moil.
Circle.
We say moil.
of the community in Paris, which
That means
means
somebody circumcised?
Yeah,
yes, all the French, all the little boys in Paris for 30 years were circumcised by Proust's great-grandfather, which I figured out is about 1,000. So this tells you the importance of that family in the Jewish community in Paris.
And Napoleon was himself a great reformer of
Yes.
Jewish life.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the one who made Jews take a family name.
Absolutely.
Because before that, they'd just been,
They had names of cities or
Yeah.
So I want to take us perhaps back to the text. We're going to read another text. We couldn't really have an event like this and talk about Proust without talking about the bedtime scene. And so we have, even though we're going slightly out of order here, we're going to go further back in the book to the moment when the narrator child ambushes his mother. She gets ready for bed in order to reclaim the goodnight kiss that she has refused him because they had a guest, Mr. Swan, for dinner. He's sure he's going to be in trouble with his parents. He's afraid that they might even send him away, but miraculously, and here is the capriciousness of the father. His father tells his mother to go and comfort him, and his mother stays with him all night in his room.
Maman spent that night in my room when I had just committed an offense so deadly that I was waiting to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I could ever have won as the reward of a good deed. I ought to have been happy. I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession, which must have been painful to her. That it was a first abdication on her part from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she, who was so brave, had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just won a victory, it was over her, that I had succeeded, as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded in relaxing her will, in undermining her judgment, and that this evening opened a new era, would remain a sad date in the calendar. And if I had dared now, I should have said to Maman, "No, I don't want you to. You mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom of what would nowadays be called the realism with which she tempered the ardent idealism of my grandmother's nature. And I knew that now the mischief was done, she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company and not to disturb my father again. Certainly, my mother's beautiful features seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she sat gently holding my hands and trying to check my tears. But just for that reason, this was just what I felt should not have been. Her anger would have saddened me less than this new gentleness, unknown in my childhood experience. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle upon her soul, and brought out a first white hair on her head. This thought redoubled my sobs. And then I saw that Maman, who had never allowed herself to go any length of tenderness with me, was suddenly overcome by tears and had to struggle to keep back her own. Then, as she saw that I had noticed this, she said to me with a smile, "Why, my little chick, little canary boy, he's going to make Maman as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you can't sleep, and Maman can't either, we mustn't go on in this stupid way. We must do something. I'll get one of your books." But I had none there. "Would you like me to get out the books now that your grandmother is going to give you for your birthday?" "Just think it over first, and don't be disappointed if there is nothing new for you then."
Let's talk, if we can, about the birthday that's coming without presents, because he gets them on this night. So the sentence always struck me because the narrator describes in a passage previous to this how he would put off the bedtime kiss for as long as possible, so as not to have to endure the sadness of its having been completed. And here it seems in some way the opposite. So it's a kind of birthday, right? That with the presents that are coming tonight. So what about this new era? What happened this night that he didn't get the kiss from his mother, and then his mother gave it to him, or his mother stayed with him anyway? What happened that made this such a marked moment in his life? Christine?
Okay. Are you asking me for a response to that question?
Well, why is this moment so important? Why does it have such weight in the book and is constantly referred to in volume after volume?
Okay, well, probably there are lots of reasons for that, but what comes to mind is that it is a vehicle early in the novel for something that's going to be a theme, more or less visible, sometimes very visible, sometimes more hidden, about the will, and where Proust is bringing in all of these late 19th century, early 20th century discourses about the will and illnesses of the will. And the word that we see so often in the text is la volonté, will, and will was really a subject of philosophical conversation. It was a subject of new disciplines, psychology, and of disciplines as we know them now mixed together. But it was a real topic of the day, and he talks about an abdication here, his mother's abdication to she gives in to him, she cedes, and how it's, you know, just the first of many, and it occasions great guilt. So it's a theme that's going to come back through all of the volumes, even much later when he's an adult, and the two of them, the son and the mother, are on a trip to Venice, and there's a dispute between them, and in the drafts that guilt towards the mother keeps coming back. So he has overcome her will and has not shown enough will in being able to wait and defer the moment of the kiss. So I think it's all about will as a theme.
And that gets replayed in the Albertine romance, doesn't it?
Yes.
Of course, it's a seminal scene in the novel. I mean, there are a number of passages that Proust had in mind for many, many years that needed to be in the novel somewhere. I mean, they were already present in The Goodnight Kiss, in Jean Santeuil, in the first drafts of the Recherche. Proust really works, Proust is an experimentalist. He writes, I mean, there are people who think that Proust is a philosopher and a theoretician of the novel. I disagree with that. He is an experimentalist. He tries. He's an essayist, and this is a passage that has been worked and reworked, that went through many trials and attempts, and finally we have the final state. We always wonder whether, because it's always so fluid, whether it's really necessary, the state that we have in Proust, because, and at the same time, it looks like it's fluid and contingent and could still change, but Proust reaches a stage where things stabilize. Often it's very late, very late. He has been working on the same passages for 30 years, since when he was very young. And of course, the scene of the Goodnight Kiss, there's something autobiographical, obviously, that has to do with Auteuil or wherever. There's something obsessional, that scene which comes back all through the book. And it has to do, as you said, with guilt, responsibility for the death of the mother. The passages where Proust describes how all pleasure of the son is a profanation of the mother. So it has to do with something that is very deep. We can't forget that, you mentioned will, we can't forget that Proust is a contemporary of Freud. And one of the reasons we still read with such passion Proust nowadays is that he understood stuff about the unconscious that Freud was studying at the same time. And we have here a scene that has to do with something that is very profound, original, and that will come back again and again. Freud discussed repetition as a symptom that keeps coming back.
Repetition, compulsion.
Compulsion. Repetition, compulsion.
Yes, compulsion. And this is what we have in Proust also.
I mean, because Freud knew that the pleasure principle was the main thing. But then he observed in the play of children that they would have the mother doll spanking the baby doll. And he thought, why would you recreate the unpleasant parts of your life? And then he thought, it's because this time you are the stage manager. You are the one. I think it's true for many writers that they explore both of their wish fulfillment, what they wish were true. But I mean, in Proust's sense, he makes them Catholic and not Jewish, and very blue chip as a family. But he does that on the one hand. That's the wish fulfillment part. Plus, everybody adores him, like all the soldiers at Doncières love him and find him so witty, and they want to spend time with him. And that must have been a fantasy. But on the other hand, he recreates these other very painful moments. And as Freud thought, they weren't ever, Freud never read Proust, Proust never read Freud, but
they are in the same
era, yeah.
I want to go back then to the idea of the mother's death, because Proust's mother had died in 1905, not that many years before Proust began composing the novel. And it's interesting in Les 75 Feuillets, the 75 pages, which is the oldest manuscripts, drafts of the book that have recently been discovered or rediscovered. In the passage in the draft of the bedtime scene, it's very interesting what happens there, because there is a sort of flash forward into the future where the narrator sees his mother on her deathbed just at the moment when he accosts her to get his goodnight kiss. And what's left in the version that we read, the final version, is that he's added some gray hairs and some wrinkles to her face. And then the actual scene of the death becomes transposed to that of the grandmother when she dies. But I think that you say, Antoine, that it's autobiographical, but in some ways it's an autobiography that moves all the way up to almost the present scene with the death of the mother, because it seems very important that in this section, it's not just the death of the mother, but also in a certain sense, a kind of murder of the mother in a way. It's almost as if the narrator is killing his mother and mastering her as mother and taking over.
Didn't Proust write a long article about a man who killed his mother?
Sentiments filiaux d'un parricide, which is written in 1907, just before Proust starts. It's really the transition between the death of the mother and writing the novel is the article Sentiments filiaux d'un parricide on not a friend of Proust's, someone he knew of the same social milieu, who killed his mother. And Proust immediately wrote this article for the Figaro, which is really a Proustan passage. So the murder of the mother, the parricide, is of course with the idea that all sons kill their mother.
Also, though, I mean, you mentioned that this, the imposition, it seems to me that the idea, and you see this in Proust's early writing, that the expression of sexuality, notably homosexuality, although it gets transposed into various other things, including female heterosexuality in his early pieces, is that the expression of sexuality is itself murderous, that you can actually kill that your sexuality kills your mother by the imposition, because the imposition of the will is linked to sexuality, and as a result, you basically spend your time, 3,000 pages, trying to impose your will on others and killing them in the process, which is why it is generally understood, I'm just going to harp on the same theme, it's generally understood that the death of Albertine is based on the death of Alfred Agostinelli, which is true, but it's also true that Albertine had to die, according to the logic of the novel, in the same way that the mother has to die, even though she doesn't die in the book.
Yeah, but you can say that Proust killed Agostinelli.
Sure.
Agostinelli had to die.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Agostinelli didn't have to die in the same way I would say that Albertine had to die. Albertine had to die according to the logic that's in the novel from the beginning. Agostinelli had to die because Proust gave him flying lessons, and he didn't know how to swim.
Elisabeth, does everyone know who Agostinelli is, or do you want to give a brief summary of who Agostinelli was?
Maybe you could.
Maybe you want to give a brief summary?
Well, there's a lot of new stuff on Agostinelli. We know much more.
But briefly, Agostinelli was Proust's chauffeur, later his secretary.
Agostinelli was Proust's chauffeur in Cabourg in 1907, and then she became his secretary in 1913. So he lived in Proust's apartment for a while with his girlfriend, and then he left Proust. And then he came back, so it's really a bit like Albertine. He came back in early 1914, and Proust paid his training to be a pilot.
And was intending to buy him an airplane.
And yes, intending to. Proust spent a lot of money on Agostinelli, who probably was never his lover, but just his driver and secretary. And as a conclusion...
Well, hang on a second. I would say never his lover, sure, but just his driver and secretary, no, he was obviously his love object.
Yeah, he was a love object, yes. The passion of Proust. And then he died because he didn't know how to swim. His plane, he was in Antibes training on a flight training tour, and he went, instead of staying above the ground, he went above the sea, stupidly, because he was not,
I didn't know what he was doing.
The instructor told him not to go.
Not to go above the sea because the winds are different, and the plane fell. The plane was not very high, and he couldn't swim and drowned. So, but at that point, there is such a confusion between life and writing that Proust was writing life and living writing. So it's a very strange state in which I guess novelists can find themselves in certain circumstances where there is really no distinction between writing and living. And this is why I say that Agostinelli died before he died. He was supposed to die, which was the logic of the novel, before he died in reality. So there's a moment when the novel becomes so, let's say, so obsessive, I would say, that there's a total, and there are moments in Proust when there is this total confusion between life and writing.
Well, I think it's interesting that we went from discussing the bedtime scene to Agostinelli, from Proust, the narrator as a child, to the narrator, Proust as a lover. But it seems to me that in a certain, Proust was writing the La race maudite, the cursed race that comes into the book at the beginning of Sodom and Gomorrah, right around the time that he was also reworking the drafts for the bedtime scene. But I wonder if there is not some kind of similarity in the theme here. On the one hand, he commandeers the mother and gets the kiss from her that she will not give him by an act of grace, which seems very similar to the idea of the sodomite, right? The one whose love is never requited, and so he gets the love by imagining that the effeminate man is really the virile man that he desires because he's really a woman inside. And so I wonder if that act of volonté, right, that act of will, right, involved in the kiss, that act of fictionalizing even, in creating a kind of reality for oneself. The kiss is not from my mother, but it is from my mother. If we don't see a kind of consonance between those two themes, that's working.
Well, I mean, the thing is that, yes, I would say that all desire, the depiction of desire, heterosexual desire, because the narrator is heterosexual desire is depicted as being very much like the fatal desire of the invert. That is to say, your sexual preference is for someone who can't ever desire you back. Yeah, because you're always there is just a de facto assumption that, that your desire can't ever be reciprocated. And so many people have noticed that.
Except in family love.
Well, I'm not sure, because, I mean, the mother, well, no. I mean, the grandmother is completely allocentric. I mean, she has no desires for herself. She is entirely devoted to the needs, to fulfilling the needs of others. The mother, though, no. I mean, the reason that the goodnight kiss scene is so emblematic, is so resonant, so representative, so exemplary, is that he's always excluded from what's going on. The beloved object is always taken care of, Monsieur Swan or whatever. So so even in the family, I mean, yeah, the grandmother is entirely is selfless. There's this ideal of, and of course, women have always been expected to be selfless. The center of their attention is always supposed to be in someone else. The grandmother is kind of an exemplary figure of female givingness, but the mother is always saying, like, no, you want to be in fact, in the 75 Feuillets, there's even it becomes more explicit. Everything is just more explicit in the 75 in these early texts, these early drafts. It says, the mother is like, no, you can't, no, I won't kiss you because you need to grow up and be virile. So giving in to you would be indulging your effeminacy. I mean, so the mother is always withholding. The love object is always withholding. The grandmother is this fantasy of complete givingness, but the mother is.
There's one scene where the grandmother, it's in the drafts, the grandmother cuts the flowers in the garden because she doesn't like the gardener. So this is the only passage where the grandmother is mean against the gardener. But this doesn't keep it, because the grandmother will become exclusively good, loving.
Well, on those words, I believe that it is time for us to have an intermission. There will be refreshments. I'm told there are madeleine. I was hoping for bœuf gelé, but madeleine should suffice. So, but we will come back again in about 20 minutes together. Now that you've had your madeleine, you will remember this afternoon forever. Well, we're going to go right into the next selection from the novel. In the second volume, along with the Jeune Fille en Fleurs, which is several English titles now, as we discussed, within a budding grove, in the shadow of young girls in flower. The narrator is on vacation with his grandmother at Balbec, and he goes to visit the studio of the painter Elstir. Elstir is the painter in Search of Lost Time. The narrator is struck by a painting that Elstir made of the harbor in the fictional Norman village Cafétuis.
Naturally enough, what Elstir, the painter, had in his studio were almost all seascapes, done here at Balbec. But I was able to discern from these that the charm of each of them lay in the sort of metamorphosis of the objects represented, analogous to what in poetry we call metaphor. That's someone else's. Sorry. And that if God the Father had created things by naming them, it was by taking away their names, or giving them other names, that Elstir created them anew. The names which designate things correspond invariably to an intellectual notion, alien to our true impressions and compelling us to eliminate from them everything that is not in keeping with that notion. It was, for instance, for a metaphor of this sort in a picture of the harbor of Carcatuis, a picture which he had finished a few days earlier and which I stood looking at for a long time, that Elstir had prepared the mind of the spectator by employing for the little town only marine terms and urban terms for the sea. Whether because its houses concealed a part of the harbor, a dry dock, or perhaps the sea itself plunging deep inland, as constantly happened on the Balbec coast, on the other side of the promontory on which the town was built, the roofs were overtopped, as they might have been by chimneys or steeples, by masts, which had the effect of making the vessels to which they belonged appear town-bred, built on land. An impression which was strengthened by the sight of other boats, moored along the jetty, but in such serried ranks that you could see men talking across from one deck to another, without being able to distinguish the dividing line, the chink of water between them. So that this fishing fleet seemed less to belong to the water than, for instance, the churches of Creekbeck, which, in the distance, surrounded by water on every side, because you saw them without seeing the town, in a powdery haze of sunlight and crumbling waves, seemed to be emerging from the waters, blown in alabaster or in sea foam, and enclosed in the band of a variegated rainbow to form an ethereal, mystical tableau. On the beach in the foreground, the painter had arranged the eye should discover no fixed boundary, no absolute line of demarcation between land and sea. The men who were pushing down their boats into the sea were running as much through the waves as along the sand, which, being wet, reflected their hulls as if they were already in the water. The sea itself did not come up in an even line, but followed the irregularities of the shore, which the perspective of the picture increased still further, so that a ship actually at sea, half hidden by the projecting works of the arsenal, seemed to be sailing through the middle of town.
The painting is, as the narrator says, it's a metaphor, right? A visual metaphor, and what we call in English a simile. Right? The simile is a kind of translation of the world describing the self to itself from within the world. And I think that this kind of metaphor is a privileged term, a privileged form for Proust, not just rhetorically, but in the act of perception itself. He writes later on in the last volume, he says, "Truth begins at the moment when, by bringing together two sensations, the writer draws out their common essence by uniting them with each other in order to protect them from the contingencies of time in a metaphor, In classical rhetoric, the metaphor is understood as ornament or embellishment, and for the Romantics, the metaphor brings something perceivable, sensible to an idea, to an intellectual apprehension. But here it seems like something else is happening, right? In that transfer of one part of perceptible experience to the other. So I'm interested in discussing this, right? How might Proust's use or idea of metaphor, how does it work in the text? What is the importance of this constant describing of something in terms of something else?
Well, first of all, I think this passage is Proust's homage to who wrote Chateaubriand, because in the Memoir d'Outre-Tombe, Chateaubriand talks about the sea in terms of the land, and of the land in terms of the sea. So this this might be a little tribute to him, or an unconscious echo, I don't know. But he admired Chateaubriand, and also Baudelaire, of course.
And if I could just add to that, Turner, the British painter Turner, whom he so admired, and of course Ruskin, one of Proust's great influences, the writer and art critic and illustrator Ruskin, whose influence is so deep in the work and whose name from one draft to another just kind of gradually dropped out of the text. So many of the paintings by Turner, please help me out, is it William Turner? Thank you, yes. He knew them through a book Ruskin published called Modern Painters. So he owned a copy of that, and these descriptions of seascapes where the land and the sea are interchangeable are also a reference to Ruskin.
And Proust translated 2 books by Ruskin.
Thank you.
And of course, Impressionism. So it's a whole, Elstier, the painter Elstier, was one of the imaginary artists in the novel with Bergotte and Vinteuil, the 3 imaginary artists, with a sort of hierarchy. Vinteuil on top, Elstier in the middle, and Bergotte probably on the lower step. So, yes, Elstier is not the greatest artist in the novel. It's Vinteuil, it's music. The hierarchy is really that comes from the Romantic. Elstier has a first period in his life, his creation, which is more or less Gustave Moreau, mythological. Then he has a Japanese period.
Like Whistler. Like Whistler,
in like the Goncourt discuss, of course, that period of Japanism, and then when the narrator, the hero, sees his workshop in Baalbek, I was going to say Cabourg, but it's Baalbek. In Baalbek, it's the Impressionist period, but he will never reach a final stage, like Vinteuil will, with the septet in La Prisonnière. It still just dissolves in the end of the novel. Elstier's trajectory is not exemplary in terms of what an artist can create in his life. He will not go beyond Impressionism as Elstier will, as Vinteuil will reach a sublime stage with the septet.
But Elstier has credit to have the only happy heterosexual love affair in the book. I mean, he loves his wife,
yes,
and
Yeah.
his wife loves him.
Yeah, except that's because she looks like his aesthetic ideals.
yes, yes. It's
Let's not get carried away.
It's not now on the metaphor and the confusion between sea and land and the theory of the metaphor. This is not what I like most in Proust. This sort of theoretical device which will be developed in Le Temps Retrouvé, in the section called that Proust calls l'adoration perpétuelle. There's a religiosity of the metaphor, sort of, which I tend to associate with the first Proust. Then he can get rid of that, of those ideas and those theories, and he really, like Vinteuil, becomes a sublime artist. So, you see, the theory of the metaphor is really a sort of scaffolding that Proust needs at the beginning to create his work. But I think that the work really goes much beyond the theory that we read at the end of the novel, in Le Temps Retrouvé, in the Adoration Perpétuelle.
When did he write the end?
But he always says, I wrote the end at the same time as the beginning at first. But of course, he died before rewriting the end in terms of what he had done in between. So we don't know what the end would have been if he had lived a bit longer. Proust died very young, at 51. And so the work is unfinished. So you see, that's why I said earlier, for me, Proust is less a philosopher and a theoretician than really an experimentalist. It's a lab. Proust now is a lab. So I tend not to give too much importance to the theory that we read in Le Temps Retrouvé, and I prefer the sort of developments that go, I think, much further than Proust's theory.
So I would agree with that, and
You would agree, or wouldn't you?
No, I would agree. I would agree that the dogma, that the dogmatic aspect of Proust, the theoretical aspect of Proust, is much less interesting than Proust actually doing what he does. Proust talking about what he's doing is much less interesting, but metaphor itself is very, I mean, he just constantly talks about things in terms of other things, which is obviously very important. I would take issue, however, with the idea that metaphor is classically merely ornamentation. If you read Homer, you will find that those similes are there all over the place for a reason. They're similes because it's an oral tradition, and you don't want, if you actually say Achilles is a lion, half your audience could be going, "What? You have a lion named Achilles?" I mean, you have in an oral tradition, you want to make sure that everyone understands entirely that you're comparing two things. But those similes are there in Homer all over the place for a reason. The comparison of things with other things, the making an appeal to the experience of the reader or the listener in order to bring an analogy is crucial in Proust and in the whole history of literature.
Most Proust metaphors are not metaphors, as Jeanette demonstrated long ago.
Well, it seems to me that the comparison of things with other things is...
The base, it's not always a metaphor. The basis is not a metaphor.
It doesn't really matter, I think.
No, it's simply that we shouldn't, we can say that there is constant transformation.
There's analogy,
Analogy.
comparison.
In English, we have, in some ways, we have this word simile that's sort of in between comparison and metaphor.
Well, the simile, I mean, Homeric simile says, and just as blah, 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 so blah, blah. Right? I mean, what's Homeric about those similes sorry, this is the Columbia Core curriculum talking. What's Homeric about the similes is that the thing being compared to the thing is developed at great length, which is what makes it very characteristic. But I mean, the comparing of things to other things is just so basic that, and yeah, it's simile, again, it's simile, that is to say the terms of the comparison are not suppressed because you don't want anyone to misunderstand. If you say, Callus is a nightingale, probably no one's going to misunderstand you, but if you say Maria Callas sings like a nightingale, which she doesn't, and I don't know why that is the example, doesn't at all, but that was for some reason the example that sprang to mind, but that way no one can misunderstand. But in any case, the comparison of things with other things is absolutely central, whatever, whether it's, and you can argue about whether it's technically simile, metaphor, then you can write a doctoral dissertation, but otherwise you can just appreciate it.
In the Poetics, Aristotle says that the most important aspect of writing is metaphor, and it's the only thing you cannot learn.
That's good.
Yeah. I mean, creative writing class will not teach you how to write good metaphor.
That's really interesting.
Another, could I jump in? Another example where metaphor or simile comes in, where Proust is exchanging sets of qualities. And an example that I found really interesting is the section when the son and mother visit Venice, because there's a whole, as you know, a whole literature on Venice, not starting with Rousseau, but Rousseau was one of the travelers to Venice, Rousseau, Byron, there's a whole tradition. And one of the commonplaces in this tradition of describing Venice is the first ride in a gondola. So your gondolier, your gondola driver,
your gondolier.
Oh, gondolier, thank you for gondolier. Your gondolier calls out the names of the palaces as you are going down the Grand Canal, the Grand Canal. And Proust, in his final text, doesn't name the palaces as they're going through the Grand Canal because he compares them to a chain of mountains. He said we were kind of gliding in between this double chain of mountains, or they were like a double chain of mountains. And then as soon as he uses that simile, all kinds of words relative to nature come into the text. But then when you go back to the 75 pages, these original drafts that were recently rediscovered, the passage is very different, and the gondolier names the palaces. So there he started with something very typical and concrete, the gondolier calling out the names of the palaces, and later they become chains of mountains.
But talking about describing things in terms of other things is just, so it's on every page. He loves to do that. And often it's very funny.
Yeah.
And often it's the basis of humor, basic humor of the book.
But another reflex of his mind is to go from the concrete in particular to the general, to find a rule about life or art or love.
Well, in that sense, he talks here about and throughout the novel, the kind of tension and dialogue even between the name and the thing. The name, sometimes the name serves as kind of barricade against the thing, right? And it helps us, it keeps us protected in our habitual world. And in the part that we cut out from the excerpt that we just read, he flashes back to a time when he's lying in bed. He hears the sound of a great ruckus, right? Almost a dispute in the street, and he hears it and can't figure out what it is. And then when he realizes that it's a carriage passing by, everything settles back into that carriage. At Doncière, he hears the ticking of the clock everywhere, all throughout the air. Finally, he sees the clock, and then the ticking stays in that one place from then on. So there's this kind of sense of the habitual that the name helps us to keep in, but at other times it's very different, right? The name permits something else beyond to arise. And so, for example, I'm just thinking in the dress of La Comtesse, the Countess, right, who can't see her own light, right? The name Guermantes provides so much possibilities for the imagination. And here in Carquetry, he says that Elstir takes away the names, right? That God that gives the names, the artist takes away the names. So how do we negotiate this different kind of relationship between name and thing? Name is habitual and name is something that embodies a world. It goes well beyond the thing it refers to.
Well, I mean, the Russian formalists thought that one of the great aspects of art was defamiliarization. And, you know, that you would describe a girl's first ball, but you would describe it in terms an anthropologist might use, not the way a society writer would use. But, and he makes a distinct tribute to both Dostoevsky and to Madame de Sévigné. Madame de Sévigné, because in her letters to her daughter, she will oftentimes describe things not in their logical order, but in the order that you apprehend them. Let's say you're coming into a town and you first see the masts of the boats, and then later you realize you see the buildings and then the boats. But Madame de Sévigné, he claims, is able to reconstruct the order in which we see things and not impress on them the logical order that we all know, but that robs things of their originality and beauty and freshness. In the same way, he says Dostoevsky develops character in this kind of weird way. I'm not too good on Dostoevsky, but anyway, I think that the idea of I mean, I remember taking painting lessons from my best friend Marilyn Shaver, and she said, "Well, you should not know that is a branch on a tree and is subordinate to the tree. You should paint it as you see it at first glance, not as the way you reconstruct its structure through your. Does that make sense? But
Yes.
But I think Proust does that.
Yeah, Proust refers to Ruskin, many on the Impressionist papers who said one should paint what one sees and not what one knows.
Yeah.
And this is Madame de Sévigné, passage on Madame de Sévigné and Dostoevsky. They paint the illusion before, the deception before.
It's also true that I mean, Madame de Sévigné and Dostoevsky have nothing in common whatsoever except what Proust lends them in that passage. So that's another example of the bringing together of disparate things that occurs all over the place, I think.
Well, what he says is that Dostoevsky's characters are not like Balzac characters. They are not seen from the outside with the description, portrait of the character. This is what he likes in Dostoevsky, and what he likes in Madame de Sévigné is based on the complicity between mother and daughter, because you don't have to give all the circumstances and context. This is why it makes this sort of impressionistic, which has to do with familiarity.
I think somebody should mention, maybe, and I will, maybe, that when Proust began his book, that he didn't know whether it should be an essay or whether it should be a novel. And he did want to write about his meeting with his mother every morning, where they would discuss ideas. And so the attacks on the critic Sainte-Beuve were supposed to be the subject of their conversation, and he thought he might present that as as an essay, but he eventually chose novel, which I think is, being a novelist, I think that's better, because the novelist.
You're also an essayist, though.
Well, that's true, but not a very good one. But the thing that is good about a novel is that it recreates the experience that leads to the insight, and whereas the essayist just presents the insight, which is not as striking or comprehensible.
Which brings us back to Antoine's point about the relationship between the theory and the fleshing out of that theory as it becomes something more material. Well, I think we should read the next passage now. This will take us somewhere different. First of all, to the third volume, the Petit Pierrepont. And here we have Albertine. And she comes, this is after their summer at Balbec, the first time that he sees Albertine amidst the band of girls there. And she comes to visit the narrator at his home in Paris. There in Balbec, the narrator had tried to kiss Albertine. And she rejected him, and she rings the bell to thwart his advances. But here now the situation is different, and it seems that he's finally will be able to fulfill his desire to kiss Albertine.
I could not help saying to myself, now at last, after failing at Balbec, I am going to discover the fragrance of the secret rose that blooms in Albertine's cheeks. And since the cycles through which we are able to make things and think people pass in the course of our existence are comparatively few, perhaps I shall be able to consider mine, in a certain sense, fulfilled, when having taken out of its distant frame the blossoming face that I had chosen from among all others, I shall have brought it into this new plane where I shall at last have knowledge of it through my lips. I told myself this because I believed that there was such a thing as knowledge acquired by the lips. I told myself that I was going to know the taste of this fleshy rose, because I had not stopped to think that man, a creature obviously less rudimentary than the sea urchin or even the whale, nevertheless lacks a certain number of essential organs, and notably possesses none that will serve for kissing. For this absent organ, he substitutes his lips, and thereby arrives perhaps at a slightly more satisfying result than if he were reduced to caressing the beloved with a horny tusk. But a pair of lips, designed to convey to the palate the taste of whatever whets their appetite, must be content, without understanding their mistake or admitting their disappointment, without roaming over the surface, and with coming to a halt at the barrier of the impenetrable but irresistible cheek. Moreover, at the moment of actual contact with the flesh, the lips, even on the assumption that they might become more expert and better endowed, would doubtless be unable to enjoy any more fully the savor which nature prevents their ever actually grasping. For in that desolate zone in which they are unable to find their proper nourishment, they are alone. The sense of sight, then that of smell having long since deserted them. At first, as my mouth began gradually to approach the cheeks with my eyes had recommended to kiss, my eyes, in changing position, saw a different pair of cheeks. a neck observed at closer range, and as though through a magnifying glass, showed in its coarser grain a robustness which modified the character of the face. So now, during this brief journey of my lips towards her cheek, it was 10 Albertines that I saw. This one girl being like a many-headed goddess. The head I had last seen, when I tried to approach it, gave way to another. At least, so long as I had not touched that head, I could still see it, and a faint perfume came to me from it. But alas, for in this matter of kissing, our nostrils and eyes are as ill-placed as our lips are ill-made. Suddenly, my eyes ceased to see. Then my nose, crushed by the collision, no longer perceived any odor, and without thereby gaining any clearer idea of the taste of the rose of my desire, I learned from these obnoxious signs that at last I was in the act of kissing Albertine's cheeks.
Does anybody else find that wildly funny? I think it's the most absurd and crazy passage.
I think it hasn't really aged all that well. Well, I mean, the fleshy rose, the horny tusk, the different pair of cheeks, it's a little bit obscene, yeah. I feel like I'm reading it inappropriately.
Of course, there's an obsession entre Proust about cheeks. Cheeks are always the objects of temptation and desire. I don't know what to say about it, but it's simply that cheeks are omnipresent in La Recherche, more than any other.
Yeah, isn't there a pillow with cheeks?
Yes, on the first page.
Weird first.
Yes,
cheeks.
yes, a weird metaphor.
Yeah.
The cheeks of the pillow on the first page of the novel. Cheeks, there are cheeks all through the book.
Many filled with cheeks, cheekful book.
There's a relatively, but very recent book by Suzanne Gerlach called Proust and Photography. And she talks about this passage because later in the same passage, the narrator makes a direct reference to recent experiments in photography. And what he's making a reference to is the experiments in proximity of perspective and distance, this back and forth between sudden changes of scale that photography and then later cinema made possible. Close, far, close, far. And it's important that he left this reference to experiments in photography in the passage because according to Suzanne Gerlach, that was the origin of this passage on proximity and distance and perception changing rapidly photography.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, he brings up a couple of different kinds of experiments in photography. There's the kind of photography that condenses so that something that's stretched out appears like it's concentrated. And then there's the kind of time-lapse photography, which I think it gets narrated here, like that of Edward Muybridge, where we see in single frames the advancement of something. Here it seems like that's what we see in those 10 Albertines. I see that Muybridge strip there.
It also, I think this passage also harks back to the moment in Swan in Love in which he's about to kiss Odette and he pauses to look at the Odette who is as yet unkissed by him and realize that will change. I think this is a sort of a slightly obscene expansion on that.
Well, also the extreme awkwardness of making love. I mean, in a way, like if you look at the beloved from some distance, you can still revere her. But if you have to kiss her, then you have your nose problem, and your lips problem, and your saliva problem. you know, it's a very funny passage.
I think this, I want to bring back, it reminds me of another passage in the first volume as well, which is that when he's in the room, the room smelling of iris, or orris root.
Orris root.
Term in English, right? Orris root. And in that room, he's looking out, and he's looking at the forest of Lusanville, and he's trying to incarnate there the girl who would, he's trying to see the girl who would incarnate the forest there. And of course she doesn't show up.
Well, he's mainly masturbating.
It's a masturbatory scene.
Yes, in the joy.
But here, something different is going on, because here it's almost as if he went into that forest and he found the girl there. But as he approaches her, like in many other scenes that we see, as he approaches her, she seems to disintegrate or disappear, or she can't provide him the pleasures, the desires. But I mean, my question originally was, what does he want from this kiss?
I mean, he always wants possession. That's what he wants, and it's never really possible.
Is this it seems to me that this is a moment of disappointment, much in a cousin perhaps to the church at Baalbek, or the theater, where the thing that he desires now turns out to be something with which he has to reconcile himself with. But it seems he already knows it too. And whenever the narrator says, "I told myself this," right, we know that there's kind of auto-persuasion going on. Well, Albertine is in this passage quite literally inaccessible. And so I thought maybe we could talk about her in that sense as a kind of Moran figure. Later on, of course, the narrator is obsessed with knowing whether Albertine is a lesbian or not. I guess my question is, right, what is lesbianism, Gomorrah, in relation to Sodom, right? The desiring being who can never have his desires reciprocated, the Sodomite, versus the Gomorran who seems to have this kind of immediate fulfillment, there's no barrier there. And I wonder if the narrator exiled from that unity here, right? I bet he's not already a Gomorran figure, and the narrator is in some wider sense a kind of sodomite.
I don't think Marcel's ever a sodomite. I mean, he's the only person in the book who isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, he's purely heterosexual. But anyway, you're the expert on Proust's lesbianism.
Yeah, I mean, Proust, Marcel Proust himself was not at all interested in lesbianism. In the book, it's the way he resolves the narrator's homosexuality, the narrator's heterosexuality, because he has to have an inaccessible object of desire, and that object of desire has to be a woman. And also the thing is that we see with Saint-Loup what happens with an obsessively jealous heterosexual man, because he's heterosexual at that moment, or is at least acting out heterosexuality at that moment. He is obsessively jealous of a woman, and so what happens is he keeps saying, "Look at that guy, he's really handsome, do you think he's handsome?" So in fact, heterosexual jealousy leads to homosexuality, in fact, in the book. Therefore, the objects of his desire, and of Swann's desire also, it's the same thing happens with Odette. When Proust's men start really desiring women and being jealous of them, they have to be lesbians, both because that means that their desires exclude the lover, and also it means that their desires are opaque, you can't imagine what they're doing, and also it means that you don't have to look closely at another man. So that's what I think.
Good. Well, I think that's a very good lead-in to our next passage that we Okay, so towards the end of volume 3, the narrator he's waiting in a kind of vigil for the Duke and Duchesse de Guermantes to come home because he's been invited to a dinner party with Prince and Princess de Guermantes. He's not sure if it's a ruse or it's a joke or not, and so he's waiting for them. And at the end, in volume 3, he tells us that he's shocked by something that he inadvertently sees and hears while he's waiting. But he doesn't say what it is, and he leaves us in a kind of uncharacteristic cliffhanger between volumes 3 and 4. And so when we begin volume 4, Sodom and Gomorrah, we finally find out. He sees Monsieur de Charlus, whose viral and aggressive presence dominated volume 3. He sees Charlus encounter Jupien, right, whose tailor shop is on the ground floor. And so what precedes is a scene of seduction. It's a wonderful scene. Then they move into Jupien's tailor shop. They have sex, and the narrator is listening intensely. And so begins a new theme in the novel, which the narrator introduces here.
I now understood how earlier, when I had seen him coming away from Madame de Villeparis's, I had managed to arrive at the conclusion that Monsieur de Charlus looked like a woman. He was one. He belonged to that race of beings less paradoxical than they appear, whose ideal is manly simply because their temperament is feminine, and who in ordinary life resemble other men in appearance only. There, where each of us carries inscribed in those eyes through which he beholds everything in the universe, a human form engraved on the surface of the pupil for them is not that of a nymph, but of an ephebe. A race upon which a curse is laid, and which must live in falsehood and perjury because it knows that its desire, that which constitutes life's dearest pleasure, is held to be punishable, shameful, an inadmissible thing, which must deny its God, since its members, even when Christians, when at the bar of justice they appear and are arraigned, must before Christ and in his name refute as a calumny what is their very life. Sons without a mother, to whom they are obliged to lie, even in the hour when they close her dying eyes. Friends without friendships, despite all those which their frequently acknowledged charm inspires, and their often generous hearts would gladly feel. But can we describe as friendships those relationships which flourish only by virtue of a lie, and from which the first impulse of trust and sincerity to which they might be tempted to yield would cause them to be rejected with disgust? Unless they are dealing with an impartial or perhaps even sympathetic spirit, who, however, in that case, misled with regard to them by a conventional psychology, will attribute to the vice confessed the very affection that is most alien to it. Just as certain judges assume and are more inclined to pardon murder in inverts and treason in Jews, for reasons derived from original sin and racial predestination. Had the paradox not been hidden from their eyes by the very illusion that made them see and live, lovers who are almost precluded from the possibility of that love, the hope of which gives them the strength to endure so many risks and so much loneliness. Since they are enamored of precisely that type of man who has nothing feminine about him, who is not an invert, and consequently cannot love them in return, with the result that their desire would be forever unappeased. Did not their money procure for them real men, and their imagination end by making them take for real men the inverts to whom they have prostituted themselves? Their honor precarious, their liberty provisional, lasting only until the discovery of their crime. Their position unstable, like that of a poet, one day feted at every drawing room and applauded in every theater in London, and the next driven from every lodging, unable to find a pillow on which to lay his head.
The end of that is a reference to Oscar Wilde, I guess, whom
Yes.
he met once or something.
Well, we don't know, but it's clearly a reference to Wilde and the comparison between the Jew and the homosexual, is the coincidence between the Wilde and Dreyfus.
Yes.
The two trials which take place in 1895 and 1895. So it's the same year, Wilde and Dreyfus, which explains the linkage that Proust makes between the two.
I met an 85-year-old retired lawyer whose first book he was writing was comparing the trial of Dreyfus and the trial of Oscar Wilde.
Wilde.
Oh, I know that book. What's the guy's name?
So the comparison was apparently obvious for a number of people. I mean, the coincidence between these two famous trials. And of course, this is again a passage that's very deep in the, again, a seminal fragment that for a very long time Proust didn't know where to place in the novel. So Proust wrote fragments and he didn't have the scenario, the overall scheme. And so it's only very late that he found the right place for this episode to create the strongest impression. And of course, you realize that what you read, it's the passage where we have the longest sentence in the whole novel, in this passage that Proust calls in the notebooks, in the drafts, la race des tantes. Tante being the word
That both
Balzac uses for vautrin
yeah.
in
And we say auntie in English.
so it's race des tantes. So it's of course it's a very, when you see that it's only one very long sentence, it's like a manifesto.
But it's, if I may, it's, so I was studying this sentence, which actually there's
another one.
Yeah, well, the earlier one, the draft of this is even longer.
Yeah, it's not the longest one.
It's the one that didn't make it into the book is it starts with Oscar Wilde instead of ending with him, or vice versa, and he keeps saying London, so it's clearly the reference to Wilde is marked. But what I discovered after reading the sentence and the other one over and over many times, probably more times than any person really wants to remain sane should do so, I discovered, to my surprise, and then got it confirmed by other people, is that the sentence actually isn't grammatically complete. It doesn't have a central verb. It's just a series of noun clauses, and you have to read it over a whole bunch of times to realize that in order to confirm that there really is no central verb. So it's really you can see the fraughtness for Proust. It just in the very grammar of this enormously long, the 900 something word. It's hard to count the number of words in French because of the
with a lot of semicolons.
Yeah.
It's the way Proust writes long sentences. They are not periods. They are just continuation with participle.
Yes, and there's one of the things we find is that the subject is often put off, deferred until long after the sentence has begun, so we don't yet know what we're talking about, even though we've already read.
That comes from the classical writing too, the periodic sentence, where you don't understand it until you get to the period.
In this case, there's no verb.
It's not a period.
No.
It's just
An accumulation.
This is often how Proust does with present participles and relatives, which makes the sentence longer and longer, but no real structure.
Well, let's go back to this passage. Elisabeth, you talked about this in your book, Proust's Lesbianism. The invert, like the idea that it's a man, it's a woman in a man's body. that for even Proust understood that this was just one type of homosexual person among others, and yet, and he says so in his letter to André Gide.
Well, yeah, that's because André Gide is upset because he doesn't like this version, but this is Proust's version. This is
Yes. Yes.
I mean, Proust doesn't, I think that Proust does not conceive of a whole taxonomy. I think that Proust and Gide just had very different views of what men who prefer men.
Well, I think Proust doesn't have a clear vision of what he thinks is the cause of homosexuality. At least I wrote a little essay showing how he had 5 different explanations of homosexuality, that one aesthetic, one inversion, another one, this kind of strange bee and flower thing that, you know.
But the thing, sorry.
Yeah, the word homosexual was not used at the time. It was a German scientific word, so Proust will never use homosexual,
No.
never speaks of homosexuality. The other word would be pederasty, which is the Gideon preference, but this is obviously not what Proust has in mind. So for Proust, inversion is the common term. It's the inversion includes for Proust every subgenre of what we would call homosexuality. There's no other word for him except don't, which he obviously prefers because he gives the title in his
Well, because he
La
says he
Résidence.
prefers it.
What?
He says he prefers it.
Yeah, La Résidence would, if he could use it, he would use don't instead of invert.
But the tragedy of the invert as depicted in this passage, that is to say, an invert is a man whose object of desire is a heterosexual, a real man, a heterosexual man, therefore is the one category guaranteed never to love him back. That description in the beginning of Sodomie Gavot 1 is not actually what we see in the rest of the novel. Right, so the theoretical paradigm that he gives us is actually not fulfilled. It's not even fulfilled in the bee and in the encounter with Charlus and Jupien. It really isn't, because Charlus, who is a woman, is also the virile bumblebee, and Jupien is the demure feminine plant.
And it's a scene of an old man and a gerontopile.
Right, it's a young man and the type put on earth for the pleasure of the old man, that is to say, the young man whose object of desire is older men. And in any case, you don't see the tragic, the portraits that he gives in that passage of the men who were doomed to spend their whole lives not realizing that it's nowhere else in the rest of the book. So the theory and the practice have very little to do with each other in the work.
The theory is also ambiguous, because at the same time there is the sort of condemnation of inversion, as he says, and then the metaphor of the bee and the Darwinian, all the passage that comes from Darwin gives a natural justification for. So at the same time we have the social condemnation.
Elsewhere he talks about the compassion that we must feel for a homosexual, since he's a human being.
Yeah, he goes. Proust is totally incoherent.
So it belongs to nature. It belongs to nature. And at the same time, it is. But you're right that. I mean, some people say that the only happy couple in the Recherche is Charlus and Jupien. At the end, in Le Temps Retrouvé, Jupien is the one who takes care of the old Charlus and who stops him when he pursues young boys. So yes, it's a couple that will last until the end of the novel.
So,
the only one.
Proust is incoherent and just, I mean, the novel is, as you will have noticed, extremely
But
long.
life is incoherent.
Yes, life is incoherent, and if you write 3,000 pages,
Yeah.
you're going to end up just saying whatever you think at the moment. And so I think that the mistake that people make is to try to make sense of it, and they assume that they lend it a credence that it doesn't really deserve. He kept on writing, and he put all sorts of incompatible things in there, and most of it doesn't make
But
sense.
this idea of the homosexual having a great desire only for heterosexual men is one you also find as late as Giovanni's Rome, that gay men are looking for a straight man, and if the straight man puts out, he's then gay, and it's therefore ruined.
The word that I find really interesting in this passage is race, la race détente. It may be in this passage, but I just looked again, I don't think it is. I think it's later in Sodom and Gomorrah when there is the metaphor of the diaspora. And Proust's narrator talks about the fact that the race, la race, of Sodomites was scattered throughout the globe. And that's why they have to have rituals for recognizing one another as belonging to the same race, because there's a diaspora of the race.
It's also true, though, that's really true, and that's part of the analogy between inverts and Jews. But it's also true that the word race in that time, you run across in that time period, la race des bourgeois, la race des commerçants. I mean, it's just the race is just an all-purpose metaphor for any group of people that
Yes.
you.
There were mainly two races in the lexicon at that point: Jews and aristocrats. The aristocrats were a race because there was blood, blue blood.
Très racé.
So race referred to Jews and aristocrats. So Proust, and of course the aristocrats are crucial in the novel also, and they are a race in the novel. So there are two races, Jews and aristocrats, and then the inverts, Proust adds.
And the thing about inverts and Jews is that they oftentimes pass. I mean, that's what we were talking about the other day, is that, you know, that you can't easily recognize a homosexual.
Except when you totally can. Like Jews and homosexuals, there's the same mythology that Proust reproduces, but he just gets it from the culture, that these two, and the analogy really works because in both cases, on the one hand, you have an extremely marked caricature of how the Jew, all those caricatures during the Dreyfus affair, the huge hook nose, and just physical characteristics of the Jew plus comportments, professions, etc. There's the instantly recognizable caricature, Jewish caricature, similarly the instantly recognizable effeminate homosexual, but on the other hand, somehow at the same time, without there being an apparent incoherence, the problem with the Jew is that you don't know who is Jewish. Same problem with the homosexual. You never know. One never knows whom one is talking to, which is why social life is so dangerous these days.
In any case, what is really striking is that almost 2/3 of this huge novel have the title Sodom and Gomorrah, because we shouldn't forget that both La Prisonnière, Albertine Disparue, and the first half of Le Temps Retrouvé are parts of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah 3, 4, and Sodom and Gomorrah suite for the first half of Le Temps Retrouvé. So with La Prisonnière and Albertine Disparue and don't really exist. There are subtitles of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah is, is more than half of this huge novel, which
and Proust was very proud of the originality of the gay theme in his book. I mean, in letters to Gallimard, he'll say, no one's ever really written about this before, and this is groundbreaking. And a lot of the critics of the day who thought that Proust was heterosexual admired his bravery in dealing with this horrible subject.
Yeah, actually, there's a letter from Jacques Rivière, I think his editor, to Proust saying, because Jacques Rivière was also the editor of André Gide and company. Jacques Rivière saying, "Oh, thank God, there's someone who deals with this awful subject in a sane way," like, which is amazing. I mean, amazing.
Wow. I think that we're about at the end of our discussion here. We have just one final passage to read, and with no discussion permitted. And it comes from the last volume.
The idea of time was of value to me for yet another reason. It was a spur. It told me that it was time to begin. If I wished to attain to what I had sometimes perceived in the course of my life, in brief lightning flashes, on the Guermantes way and in my drives in the carriage of Madame de Villeparisis, at those moments of perception which had made me think that life was worth living. How much more worth living did it appear to me now that I seem to see that this life that we live in half darkness can be illuminated. This life that at every moment we distort can be restored to its true pristine shape. That a life, in short, can be realized within the confines of a book. How happy would he be, I thought, the man who had the power to write such a book? What a task awaited him. To give some idea of this task, one would have to borrow comparisons from the loftiest and the most varied arts. For this writer, who moreover must bring out the opposite facets of each of his characters in order to show its volume, would have to prepare his book with meticulous care, perpetually regrouping his forces like a general conducting an offensive. And he would have also to endure his book like a form of fatigue, to accept it like a discipline, build it up like a church, follow it like a medical regime, vanquish it like an obstacle, win it like a friendship, cosset it like a little child, create it like a new world without neglecting those mysteries whose explanation is to be found probably only in worlds other than your own, and the presentiment of which is the thing that moves us most deeply in life and in art. In long books of this kind, there are parts which there has been time only to sketch, parts which, because of the very amplitude of the architect's plan, will no doubt never be completed. How many great cathedrals remained unfinished? The writer feeds his book. He strengthens the part of which are weak. He protects it. But afterwards, it is the book that grows, that designates its author's tomb and defends it against the world's clamor, and for a while, against oblivion. But to return to my own case, I thought more modestly of my book, and it would be inaccurate even to say that I thought of those who would read it as my readers, for it seemed to me that they would not be my readers, but the readers of their own selves. My book being merely a sort of magnifying glass, like those which the optician at Combray used to offer his customers. It would be my book, but with its help, I would furnish them with the means of reading what lay inside themselves, so that I should not ask them to praise me or censor me, but simply to tell me whether it really is like that. I should ask them whether the words that they read within themselves are the same as those which I have written.
Wow. the Proust Reading Group and the library. I want to express my gratitude to our four panelists and to Sarah Holliday of the library, who's really helped make all this happen. I want to give a big thank you to our two leaders, Paul Ankah and Paul Moran, as well as to Marcel Scheindlin, who read us those first lines of the book. Thank you, all of you, those of you who are in chairs here and those of you who are in your living rooms somewhere. Thank you for coming to commemorate and appreciate Proust with us tonight.
Thank you.
Four of you, all of you four have been reading Proust and writing about Proust and studying Proust for many years. What brought you to Proust and what kept you with him through this career? Let's start with Christine.
Oh, did you want to start at the other end this time?
We can go this way.
How is this? Is it good? Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for being here today, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this event and Noam Scheindlin for inviting me to be part of this panel, the members of the Proust Reading Group, Robert McDonald, and other organizers whom I haven't yet met. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'll just say briefly that I came to Proust as an undergraduate at Smith College, and that reading Proust was part of learning French for me. So it never ceased to be a part of learning and mastering the French language and being immersed in French culture, first by reading Proust in undergraduate courses when I was still learning the language, and later on junior year abroad when we had the honor of being taught by Michel Raymond of the Sorbonne, who had written a book, The Crisis of the Novel, 1983, La Crise du Roman. And Michel Raymond was a great Proust specialist, and he taught us a specialized course that year on one volume, and the volume he chose was Within a Budding Grove. And I remained with it because I went to graduate school and wrote a dissertation on Proust, and what keeps me in it is that there is always a group of readers and scholars interested in Proust, so there is really a Proustian community out there.
Well, good afternoon. I'm also very glad to be here tonight, this afternoon. It was good to avoid Paris this week. I came back from Paris last Sunday. I was in Paris last week. And there were a huge number of celebrations around Proust. Yesterday at the Père Lachaise at Proust's grave. A couple of days ago at Proust's apartment, the apartment where he died, Rue Hamelin. There was also an event. So that it's very striking for us, specialists of Proust, to observe what is going on during this centennial, which I think we didn't expect. We didn't expect the scale of the event, how huge the celebration would be. A number of years ago, I think it is 30 years ago, I wrote a piece in Pierre Nora's Lieux de Mémoire, Realms of Memory, where I describe Proust as a memory place of France. And at the time, 30 years ago, I thought that Proust was at the acme of his celebrity, that he couldn't reach a higher degree of almost monopoly in French literature, because there is something which is also a bit frightening about the place that Proust occupies in French literature in 2022. At that point, I suggested that for many years, Proust had been read in spite of the fact that he was Jewish or half Jewish and homosexual. And then at some point in the 1960s or 1970s, we started to read Proust because he was Jewish and homosexual. So I don't know at this point why we read him. We read him at the same time because he was Jewish and homosexual, and in spite of the fact that he was, but in any case, we can no longer escape Proust. When I first read Proust, it was in 1966, 1967, when I was a senior in high school, my last year of high school in France. At the time, I'd heard nothing about Proust. The only reason I read Proust is because he became available as a paperback. And I bought it in a bookstore in the city where I was in a boarding school. Nowadays, nobody can escape Proust. Everybody knows the first page. This little boy already knows it by heart. In a couple of years, he will know the whole book by heart. So everybody knows something about Proust. At least the first sentence. At least the Madeleine. The Madeleine is probably the most famous literary object in world literature. Which means that whenever one opens the book, one knows almost everything already. One, as I often say, it's impossible to read Proust. You only reread Proust. Everybody rereads Proust. So, of course, for scholars, what is going on this year it's quite surprising, and it's good to be in New York and to be with you instead of in this crazy atmosphere of Paris this year, where there are events after events about Proust. At least there's only one in New York this week, and it's good for someone who has worked on Proust. I started working on Proust more than 40 years ago, in the early 1880s, for the critical edition of the new Pléiade that was done in the 1980s. So I've been working on Proust for 40 years. And it's still intriguing that whenever you work on Proust, you can discover new stuff. I published a book, you said, last year, Proust du côté juif, the Jewish side of Proust, which will be translated by Columbia University Press. And it's a book where I think there are a lot of things that nobody knew about Proust that are in that book. So you can still work on Proust, find new stuff, discover new interpretations. Proust is very rich. But I hope that other French writers are still read and will still be read. I almost never teach Proust, because I think there's already too much about Proust. I will teach Valérie or Claudel or Peggy, contemporaries of Proust, or Colette, who tend to be ignored because, in French literature, there was never a Shakespeare, a Dante, a Cervantes, or I'm forgetting someone, I don't remember, Goethe. French literature was always couples, Racine and Corneille, Voltaire and Rousseau. We could never decide in the 19th century who was the French writer who would be the epitome of French literature. And now we have Proust. But of course, the idea of one writer who represents the spirit of a nation is completely outdated, out-fashioned in this age of diversity. So it's too late for Proust. I hope to be the one that represents the whole of French literature.
Good luck with that. So I too would like to thank everyone involved in this. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's it's exciting that this is happening, especially in this tremendously beautiful building, beautiful and historically resonant building. Let's see. Well, I'm about to teach Proust to Columbia undergraduates on Monday, and I too would definitely be teaching Colette and Valérie and Peggy and maybe not Claudel, but the thing is that they haven't read Proust, so I figure they might as well. But in any case, so I first read Proust when I was 19 years old. I was in Paris on my sophomore year abroad at Reed Hall. At Columbia's center in Paris. I was not a Columbia student because Columbia did not admit girls at that time, but I was there at Reed Hall, and I was working on something entirely unrelated. In fact, I was working under the direction of the now late Jean-Yves Pouillou on modern Greek poetry. I find it kind of strange now, even myself, that I had gone to Paris to study modern Greek poetry, but I think that they wouldn't send me to Greece to study modern Greek poetry, but only archaeology. But so I went to Paris and I was studying, I was trying to write a little undergraduate essay on, little thesis on George Seferis, and I ended up working on a poem called Piazza San Nicolo, of which the first line is Longtemps je me suis couché de bonne heure, in italics in French, in the Greek poem. And I had chosen this poem specifically because I didn't understand it at all. Jean-Yves Pouillou said, you know, you might want to read the book that this is taken from, and I had heard of Proust. I think that my parents actually had that Modern Library edition, the Moncrief translation, but I didn't go looking in my parents' library for things to read. So Jean-Yves Pouillou said, you know, you might really get a lot out of it, get something out of about the poem, but you also might enjoy it. So I thought, oh, this is a great way to procrastinate because this is something that's not actually assigned, but sort of peripheral. So I went walking out of his office and into the first bookstore I encountered, which is about 3 feet away because at that time there were bookstores all over the place. And I didn't even know, I asked what the first volume was. I bought Du Côté de Chez Swann. I started reading it. My French wasn't very good, but nonetheless, I just started reading it, and I couldn't believe that it existed. I just couldn't believe that there was something that spoke to my own neurotic, obsessive personality in this way. And I think it helps to have a certain kind of obsessional neurosis to really glom onto Proust. Because I know lots of people, in fact, who have some who have written books on Proust, but who had read it and not really gotten it, and then gone back much later on. But at 19, I just couldn't believe that there was someone who spoke to my own neurotic, compulsive, obsessional personality in that way. So I continued reading through, and I think what kept me reading was not just that, but also how funny it is, an aspect that's often neglected. And so I started reading. I read through to the end of the first volume. I did write my thing on Seferis, but after that I dropped modern Greek poetry. And I just thought, well, if only there were a way to get paid for reading Proust and thinking about him and talking about this stuff. I mean, I also liked other, I was a very literary young person. And I thought, well, actually there is, in fact, a profession. I didn't really like school very much, but I found very appealing the idea of actually being able to do this as a profession. So I went to graduate school, and when I was ready to apply to graduate schools, I thought, well, why bother applying any other place than Columbia, because Columbia is Proust Central. And so I went to Columbia and I wrote a master's thesis on Proust and Baudelaire and a doctoral thesis on Proust and Madame de Sévigné, both under the direction of Antoine Compagnon. And then I went off and taught at the University of Virginia for 13 years, and then I was hired back to Columbia. And that's my story. And I've been reading Proust and talking about him and writing about him ever since. And so I wrote as Noam mentioned, I took a break to write a book about literary censorship trials, and I thought, okay, enough of Proust, it's enough of Proust, but apparently not, because now I'm back to Proust. So that's what I have to say. Over to you, Edmund.
Well, I think I started reading Proust even younger than you guys, but because is this on?
Yeah.
I was at a boarding school, and I wrote I was such a pretentious kid, and I for my English class I wrote an article on the Madame de Sévigné effect on Proust.
Wow. My goodness.
And anyway, so then I think the first time I read Proust, I was really, I think about 30 when I read the whole thing. I had hepatitis, and there was nothing better to do. And also, I belonged to a group of friends who were all reading Proust. And as you probably know in this room, one of the great pleasures of reading Proust is to talk to your friends about, oh, he's kind of a Monsieur de Norpois type, isn't he? Because you recognize all kinds of types in your real life from Proust, and I belong to a group of friends who all read it together, not in a formal way, but in an informal way. And then I wrote a biography of Jean Genet, and the thing that made him want to start writing was reading Proust. He was in prison, and he went to the weekly exchange of books, and there was one book, he got there a little late, and nobody wanted this tattered volume of Proust, so everybody else had taken murder mysteries or whatever. So he got back, and he had the volume where they're talking about inviting Monsieur de Norpois to dinner and making him a boeuf à la mode, and Proust, Genet read that, and he thought, I'm going to close this book because I want to read it so slowly, because I know I will go from miracle to miracle, and I will become the Proust of the underclass, which he did, and or at least something like that. But he only had schooling until he was 12, though he was the best student in his whole county, and he refused to speak the dialect of the Morvan where he grew up, and he spoke Parisian French, and everybody thought that was very pretentious. And anyway, he for somebody who was of a working class background and a criminal the whole first half of his life, he's a very literary writer, and I think a lot of that was the inspiration of Proust. Anyway, I was asked to write about a little short biography of Proust. That was the first in a series of short biographies, and that pleased. I never wanted to write another long biography, but I was happy to write the short one of Rimbaud and a short one of Genet. Anyway, that's my story.